The dark history of the amusement park. I've always been drawn to places that others avoid. The abandoned, the forgotten, the places steeped in mystery and darkness. And that's how I found myself standing in front of the old amusement park. The one that everyone in town whispered about. The one that had been closed for decades. It stood like a forgotten relic of a more joyful time, its rusted rides and decaying structures serving as silent witnesses to its past. The amusement park, once known as Carnival of Lights, had been a booming hotspot for families in the late 60s and early 70s. It was the pride of the town. Children running around with candy in their hands, couples holding hands while riding the Ferris wheel, the laughter of excited visitors filling the air. But then, in the summer of 1974, everything changed. It wasn't a gradual decline. No, it happened suddenly, violently, as if some dark force had seized control. That summer, a series of strange incidents unfolded. It started with the disappearance of a young girl. Her name was Lily, and she was just 8 years old. She was last seen riding the carousel, her smile as bright as the sun. But when her mother returned to collect her, the carousel was empty. The park staff insisted that she had simply wandered off, but something didn't feel right. Lily's disappearance wasn't the only odd thing to occur. Within the next few weeks, several workers quit, claiming they had seen figures lurking in the shadows, heard strange whispers in the night, and felt cold spots in places where there should have been warmth. The rides, once lively and joyful, began to malfunction in bizarre ways. The Ferris wheel would sometimes freeze midair. The carousel would spin without anyone riding it, and the old roller coaster would move on its own, even without power. Rumors started to spread, and the town began to believe that the park was cursed, that something evil had taken root there. Some claimed the park was built over an old burial ground. Others whispered that the land had once been used for dark rituals. No one knew for sure, but the fear was palpable. And then, the tragic event occurred. Late one night, during a routine maintenance check, one of the workers, a young man named Thomas, was found in the old funhouse, hanging by a thick rope, his eyes wide open, filled with terror. The police ruled it as suicide, but the workers knew better. Thomas had been terrified of the funhouse, claiming it felt as though something was watching him. His death wasn't the end, though. The town was on edge. The amusement park had become a symbol of fear, and no one dared to go near it. But I couldn't help myself. I had always been fascinated by the unknown, the places that held secrets no one dared to uncover. So, one fateful evening, I decided to visit the park, to see it for myself, to feel what others had felt. I walked through the rusted gates, the air thick with the smell of decay. The old sign that once read Carnival of Lights had been worn away, leaving behind only a ghostly outline. As I wandered deeper into the park, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant creaking of the Ferris wheel as it swayed in the wind. There was something about the place, something wrong, something that tugged at my very soul. I didn't know it at the time, but that night would change me forever. The deeper I went, the more I felt the presence of something watching me. I passed the old roller coaster, its tracks now rusted and twisted, but I could swear I heard the faint sound of the cars rattling, as if the ride was still in motion. My footsteps echoed in the empty park, each one amplifying the sense of unease that was settling into my chest. And then I heard it. A soft whisper, like a breath against my ear. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned around, but there was no one there. I continued, though, driven by the need to understand. I came upon the funhouse, its entrance dark and foreboding. The once colorful facade was now peeling and faded, but I could still make out the twisted faces that had once grinned at visitors. Something about it felt alive. It was as if the funhouse had a pulse, its wooden boards creaking as though it was breathing. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe some old forgotten junk, maybe some lingering ghosts. But I didn't expect the sudden cold that hit me as I stepped inside. It was as if the air had dropped to freezing in an instant. I shivered, my breath visible in the dim light. The mirrors inside were cracked and distorted, reflecting twisted versions of myself that made me feel as if I was being pulled into the very walls of the building. As I walked further, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct in my body told me to leave, and then I saw Higt, a figure, barely visible in the shadows. It stood still, just out of reach, but I could see its eyes, wide, dark, empty. It was watching me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. As the figure slowly began to step forward, its footfalls soft but deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest and my instinct screamed for me to run, but I couldn't look away. The figure stepped closer, its face now visible in the dim light. It was the face of a child, or at least it looked like one. But something was off. The eyes were too wide, the smile too stretched, and the skin. It was pale, almost gray, like the color of death. Before I could react, the lights flickered and the funhouse door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The laughter of children filled the air, distorted and twisted, as if coming from 1,000 different directions. The mirrors reflected nothing but darkness now. I wasn't alone anymore. And that was just the beginning. The story of the Carnival of Lights didn't end there. It never truly ended. The night I visited the old amusement park, something inside me whispered that I wasn't just going to uncover the past. I was going to be a part of it somehow. My curiosity had led me deeper into that cursed place, where the air was thick with forgotten fears, and the shadows felt like they were closing in around me. I remember the faint whispers I heard when I first stepped inside the funhouse. The way the air turned icy, as if I had crossed into another realm. But that was only the beginning. I wish I could say it was just a haunted park, full of creepy noises and abandoned rides. I wish I could chalk it all up to my imagination. But the truth is, I felt something there that night. Something alive. As I moved further through the park, I kept hearing sounds I couldn't explain. Footsteps behind me when I was sure I was alone. The sound of laughter that seemed to float in the air, out of nowhere. But nothing was as unnerving as what happened next. It was around midnight when I found myself standing in front of the old Ferris wheel. The once majestic ride now stood still and lifeless, a rusty skeleton against the night sky. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just an old amusement ride. There was a presence there, something that hadn't left. I took a hesitant step forward, the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel, the only thing breaking the oppressive silence. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound from above, like the creaking of the Ferris wheel's gears. The ride was not moving, of course. It hadn't been functional in years. But there it was, the unmistakable sound of something stirring, like a whisper carried by the wind. I looked up, but the platform was empty. I didn't know why I felt compelled to walk closer, but something pulled me toward the Ferris wheel. I stood under its shadow, staring up at the abandoned ride, feeling a chill run through my spine. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the sound of someone walking behind me grew louder. My heart raced. Slowly I turned around, half expecting to see another curious wanderer who had dared to enter the park. But there was no one, just emptiness. I was alone, or so I thought. That's when the whispers started. They came softly at first, barely audible, like a breath against my ear. Help me. The words were almost too soft to catch, but they were unmistakable. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I spun around again, but there was no one. The whispers grew louder, filling the air around me. I could feel the cold breath of the voice, as if it were right there, standing beside me. I wanted to scream, but something kept me quiet. I couldn't move. Help me, the voice repeated, now clear and desperate. I took a step back, my legs feeling like lead. The voice seemed to echo in my mind, mixing with the sound of the wind. And for a brief moment, I thought I could see something in the shadows. Someone. A figure. I turned quickly, almost stumbling in my haste to get away. But that was when I saw it. In the distance, near the old carousel, I saw a figure standing there, shrouded in darkness. A woman. She stood still, her back to me. Her hair long and wild, blowing in the wind as though she were part of the night itself. I didn't want to approach. Every part of me screamed to turn around and run, but something in me, some unexplainable force, pulled me toward her. I had to know who she was. As I walked closer, the whispers continued, swelling around me like a storm, filling my head with images and sounds. The air felt thick, heavy. The figure didn't move as I neared. She didn't acknowledge me. But there was something about her, a coldness in the air, a chill that made my teeth ache. The closer I got, the more I realized. Her skin was gray, pale, almost as if she were a ghost tethered to this place. I stopped just a few feet away from her, and then she turned. Her eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light around her. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I felt her gaze pierce into me, deep into my soul. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then I heard it. The laughter, not from her, but from the carousel. The carousel, which had been motionless just moments before, was now turning slowly, its lights flickering on one by one, lighting up the faces of the twisted, worn-out figures. The clattering of the horses' hooves echoed in the distance, an eerie, distorted melody. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My body felt frozen, trapped in this nightmare. I looked back at the woman, but she was gone. She had vanished into thin air. I turned around frantically, my breath coming in ragged gasps. That's when I saw it, the old fun house. The doors were now wide open, as though inviting me in. I didn't want to go, but the compulsion was undeniable. My feet moved of their own accord. I couldn't stop. As I entered the fun house, I felt a weight on my chest, as though the very air inside was thicker, more oppressive. The mirrors inside were cracked, some shattered completely, their jagged edges gleaming under the dim light. I caught a glimpse of myself in one of them, but what I saw wasn't me. It was a twisted version of myself, a distorted, monstrous reflection with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. I gasped and stepped back, but the reflection didn't. It stayed there, mocking me. I felt my pulse quicken, my skin crawling. The whispers began again, louder this time, filling my ears, repeating the same words over and over. Help me. Suddenly, the mirrors seemed to shift. They warped and bent, the reflections of the funhouse distorting into faces. Faces of children, pale and lifeless, their eyes wide with terror. They reached out to me through the glass, their fingers pressing against the mirrors, begging for help. But I couldn't help them. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs shaking beneath me. The laughter followed me. It wasn't just from the carousel anymore. It echoed from all around me, as though the very walls of the park were alive, mocking me, chasing me. The sounds were deafening, drowning out everything else. When I finally stumbled out of the funhouse, I found myself back near the Ferris wheel, breathing heavily, drenched in cold sweat. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew I had seen something real. The spirits that haunted the park weren't just figments of the past. They were still there, still trapped in that place, reaching out to those who dared to enter. I left that night, but the whispers followed me. They didn't stop. They never stopped. By the time I left the funhouse, my mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Every part of me screamed to get out, to leave the cursed amusement park behind and never look back. But I couldn't. There was something about that place, something pulling me deeper into its dark heart. The whispers had stopped for a moment, but they still lingered in my mind. They followed me, like an invisible presence, always just behind me, always reminding me that I was never truly alone. As I walked through the park, the atmosphere felt different now. The once innocent amusements, those rides that had once promised laughter and joy, had turned into something sinister, darkened by years of neglect and ghostly inhabitants. I passed the carousel, and for a moment I could swear the horses were looking at me, their lifeless eyes following my every movement. The sounds of the ride creaking in the wind were the only noise, but the emptiness around me felt oppressive, as if the park itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. Then I heard the footsteps again, soft at first, like the shuffle of someone walking in the distance. I turned quickly, half expecting to see someone or something approaching, but there was no one in sight. The footsteps continued, now growing louder, moving toward me. My pulse quickened as I backed away, eyes darting around in panic. That's when I saw her again. The woman, the one I had seen near the Ferris wheel earlier. She was standing in the distance, her back to me once more. Her wild hair whipped around in the wind, and I could feel the chill in the air as I stared at her. This time, however, she wasn't as far away. She was closer, too close. I tried to speak, but my throat tightened. The words wouldn't come. I tried to turn and run, but my body refused to move, frozen in place. My breath caught in my chest as I saw her face turn slowly toward me. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel her gaze, like a cold dagger, in my heart. She took a step forward. Another. Then another. I couldn't breathe. I could barely move. I was caught in her gaze, hypnotized by the darkness in her eyes. She was getting closer, her figure becoming clear with every step. Her mouth parted, but this time, no words came out. Only a soft, mournful whisper. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Her voice was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, but it was unmistakable. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my feet refusing to budge. The darkness around her seemed to grow, swallowing the light from the few lanterns that still flickered in the park. She took another step, and suddenly, the carousel's music blared to life, its eerie melody filling the air with a maddening tune. The horses on the ride began to move, their eyes following me, their mouths twisted into grins. The woman was almost upon me now. I could see her clearly, her pale skin, her long black dress fluttering in the wind. She reached out a hand, her fingers gnarled and cold. Just as I thought she would touch me, a loud bang echoed through the park. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest. But when I looked back at her, she was gone. The carousel had stopped. The park was silent once more. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it all. The woman, the ghosts, the whispers. Had they been real? Or had my fear played tricks on me? I didn't have time to think. As I turned to leave, I noticed something strange near the entrance of the park. A gate that had been closed earlier. Now it was wide open, as though inviting me in. I hadn't seen anyone come through, and I hadn't heard the gate open. Yet, there it was, waiting. I didn't want to go back in. I didn't want to face whatever had been haunting me. But that same pull, that same force that had drawn me deeper into the park before, was there again. Reluctantly, I walked toward the gate, my hands trembling as I stepped into the darkness beyond. The moment I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped drastically. I could see my breath in the air. It wasn't just cold. It was unnatural. The world around me seemed to grow dimmer, as though the very light had been drained from it. The gate slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash, and I whipped around, only to find that the park was now a maze of shadows, a labyrinth with no clear path out. Suddenly, I heard the soft sound of laughter, childlike, high-pitched. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the broken rides coming from every direction. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But then I saw them. The children. They were standing by the old roller coaster, their faces pale and lifeless. Their eyes were wide open, staring directly at me, as if they were waiting for something. Their clothes were tattered, their hair disheveled, and their bodies were thin and gaunt, like they hadn't been alive for years. But there they were, standing in the moonlight, their mouths hanging open in silent screams. I took a step back, heart racing. "Who are you?" I whispered, but the words barely escaped my lips. One of the children, no older than 8 or 9, stepped forward, his hand outstretched, his fingers twitching as though he were trying to reach for something. The others followed, their movements stiff and unnatural. The laughter grew louder, as though the entire park was laughing at me, mocking my fear. No, no, I whispered, backing away, but they followed. The child with outstretched hands drew closer, and before I could turn to flee, I felt a cold hand brush my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The cold hand, however, didn't leave. It gripped me tighter, icy fingers digging into my skin. I gasped, trying to pull away, but the hand only tightened its grip. "Help me," the voice whispered again, faint but unmistakable. It was the same voice I had heard earlier. The voice of the woman, the voice of the spirits trapped in the park. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Panic surged through me as I realized I was no longer alone. The figures of the children, the woman, and something darker, more menacing, had surrounded me. I couldn't see their faces clearly anymore. They were just shadows, moving, shifting, like the very night itself. Then, from behind me, I heard a deep, guttural growl. Something massive. Something that didn't belong to the world of the living. I turned to face it, and that's when I saw it. A figure, tall and twisted. A shadow with eyes that burned like embers. It moved toward me, its footsteps echoing in the silence. Each step sending shivers down my spine. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was the glowing red eyes of the creature, and the whispers, always the whispers, growing louder. Help me. I had barely managed to escape the clutches of the ghosts when something deep within me urged me to press on. It was as if the park itself was a puzzle, each piece of its dark history hidden in the shadows calling to me, daring me to uncover the truth. I couldn't leave without knowing more, without understanding what had brought these souls to this forsaken place. There were mysteries here, so many unsolved questions that I had to answer. As I stumbled through the park, now more aware of its supernatural hold over me, I began to notice small details I hadn't before. The graffiti on the walls, hastily drawn symbols I didn't recognize, the broken mirrors reflecting nothing but darkness, the rusted gates that creaked in the wind as though alive. There were signs, clues left behind that pointed to something far darker than I could have ever imagined. The whispers had stopped for the moment, but the presence was still there, unseen, but never gone. My mind was in overdrive, trying to piece together what I had witnessed. The woman in the black dress, the children with hollow eyes, the laughter that filled the air. It all pointed to one thing. Something had happened here. Something that had left a mark on the land itself. I headed toward the abandoned roller coaster, the one that I had passed earlier when the shadows had first begun to close in around me. There was something about it that felt important. Something that had been drawing me in ever since I set foot in the park. As I neared the old ride, I saw a flash of movement in the corner of my eye. A figure, too quick to make out. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper, fearing that it might be swallowed by the heavy silence that surrounded me. No answer. Only the wind, whispering through the abandoned structures, carrying with it the scent of decay and long-forgotten memories. I stepped forward cautiously, each footfall echoing in the hollow space around me. The closer I got to the roller coaster, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There, in the ruins of the old station, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a small notebook, half buried in the dirt, its pages yellowed and fragile from age. I kneeled to pick it up, my hands trembling, as I carefully opened the first page. It was a journal written in a shaky hand. I began to read, my eyes scanning the words that seemed to bleed onto the page. The park has always been alive in ways I can't explain. People come and go, but there's something in the air here, something darker than we're meant to understand. I've seen it, heard it, the voices in the night, the shadows that move when no one is around. I'm starting to believe this place is cursed. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The very idea that this park was alive, that it had a dark force pulsating through it, seemed impossible. But as I read further, I realized the journal's writer was no ordinary person. This was someone who had been here for a long time, someone who had seen the truth behind the park's facade. I don't know who built this place, but I've heard stories from the older workers. They say the park was once meant to be something grand, an escape, a dream come true. But something went terribly wrong. There were accidents, so many accidents. People disappeared without a trace, their names forgotten, their bodies never found. And then there are the others, the ones who didn't leave, the ones who still walk the grounds trapped in the park, their souls bound to its gates. I stopped reading, my throat tightening. I could feel the weight of the journal's words, each one pulling me deeper into the mystery, into the darkness that had taken hold of this place. I had to know more. The journal continued, and as I read on, I learned that the writer had been part of the park's maintenance crew, someone who had worked here for years, witnessing the strange and terrifying happenings firsthand. He spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of voices that whispered secrets into the wind, of the rides that ran themselves when no one was near. He even mentioned that some of the employees had seen people, their faces twisted in agony, on the rides, long after the park had closed. But it wasn't just the employees who had been affected. Tourists who had visited the park spoke of strange occurrences, disorienting dreams, unexplained voices, and even sightings of figures that weren't there. The more I read, the more I realized that something insidious was lurking beneath the surface. Something that had been feeding off the fear and suffering of those who had come here over the years. I was no longer sure if I wanted to uncover the truth. The more I learned, the more I realized how little I understood about what had happened here. But something drove me forward. Something inside me that refused to back down. Even as I felt the weight of the curse bearing down on me. I closed the journal and stood up, my head spinning. I had to find out who had written this, what had happened to them, and why they had left such a detailed account of the horrors within the park. But as I turned to leave the roller coaster station, something caught my eye. An old photo, crumpled and faded, lying in the corner of the room. I walked over and carefully picked it up, my hands trembling. The image was blurry, the edges worn and torn, but I could make out a group of people. They were standing together, smiling as though they had no care in the world. It was a photo of the park staff, but something was off. The faces of the people were unnaturally pale, their eyes wide and glassy. They looked as though they had been drained of all color, their smiles frozen in an eerie, unnatural way. As I stared at the photo, I felt a chill run down my spine. One of the people in the photo looked familiar. Someone I had seen earlier that night. The woman in the black dress, the one who had been haunting me. She was in the photo standing near the back, her face obscured by shadows. That was when I realized the truth. The woman, the children, the spirits, they weren't just random apparitions. They were connected to the park, to the very land beneath my feet. The park had taken them, and they had never left. I quickly stuffed the photo into my pocket and turned to leave, my heart pounding in my chest. I had learned enough for one night. But as I reached the park's exit, I felt the unmistakable presence of something watching me, something waiting. I couldn't help but look back, and in the distance, standing at the gates of the abandoned carousel, I saw her again. The woman in the black dress. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I realized she wasn't a victim of the park. She was the park, or at least a part of it. And I knew then that leaving wouldn't be as simple as walking out the gate. The mysteries of the park were far from solved. In fact, I had only begun to scratch the surface. I had gathered enough fragments of the park's dark past to understand one thing. No one ever truly leaves. The spirits, trapped in this eternal loop of torment, were not just memories of the past. They were a part of the very fabric of the park itself. Every shadow, every whisper, every cold gust of wind carried their essence, their pain, their anger. But as much as I tried to convince myself that I had to leave, my legs refused to obey. The park had a pull on me, and it was growing stronger by the minute. There was no way I could just walk away. Something inside me, some deep instinct, told me that I needed to confront whatever had been festering in the heart of this place. It was then that I felt it, a sudden, suffocating pressure. The air grew heavier, and the ground beneath my feet trembled, as if the park itself was awakening, rising from a deep slumber. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and the silence, once comforting, now felt like a prelude to something terrible. I turned, looking around, trying to make sense of what was happening, and then I saw her again. The woman in the black dress, standing in the distance, not far from the old carousel. Her eyes glowed now, an unnatural, eerie light that pierced through the darkness. She wasn't alone. The children appeared next, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their faces twisted in agony, their mouths silently pleading for release, but they didn't speak. Instead, they moved toward me, gliding across the cracked pavement like phantoms, their feet barely touching the ground. My pulse quickened. The air felt electric, charged with something dark, something ancient. The spirits were not just haunting me. They were drawing closer, feeding off my fur, trying to drag me into their world. I turned to run, but my legs refused to move. It was as if the ground had taken hold of me, as if the very park had a grip on my soul. The woman in black was closer now, her figure becoming more solid, more real. I could see her clearly, her face gaunt, her lips parted in a cruel smile. Her eyes burned with an intensity that I couldn't escape. "You shouldn't have come." Her voice echoed in my mind, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. "Now you belong to us." The words sent a jolt of terror through me, but before I could react, I felt something cold brush against my arm. I looked down, and there they were, the children. Their hands, pale and lifeless, reached out to me, their fingers curling around my wrist with a strength I couldn't resist. I tried to pull away, but it was as if their touch was freezing my very soul. "Let me go!" I screamed, but the words barely left my mouth before they were drowned out by a deafening noise, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from deep within the park, from beneath the ground itself. It was the sound of something ancient, something far older than any of us. Something that had been lying dormant for years, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The ground beneath me cracked open, and a black, swirling vortex began to form, sucking in everything around it, dust, debris, the very air itself. The spirits were no longer mere shadows. They were becoming more tangible, their forms growing larger and more menacing, their eyes burning with the intensity of their pain and rage. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The vortex was pulling me toward it, dragging me closer to its center. My vision blurred, and I could feel the cold, suffocating darkness wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. The woman in black stepped forward, her smile widening. She stretched out her hand, and I could see her fingers twitching, as though beckoning me to her. "No, please," I gasped, but it was too late. With one final tug, the ground beneath me gave way, and I fell into the abyss. But then, something unexpected happened. Just as I thought I was lost forever, I felt a sudden burst of warmth, a force that seemed to cut through the darkness like a knife. It was a voice, faint but familiar. "Get up. Get up now." It was the voice of the park's original caretaker, the one who had written in the journal, the one who had warned me about the curse. Somehow, I could hear him, feel his presence, even though he was long gone. I struggled against the pull of the vortex, my hands reaching out for anything solid. In the chaos, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the dark pit. The caretaker, his face worn but determined. He reached out, his hand extending toward me, pulling me out of the abyss, out of the grip of the park. With every ounce of strength, I grasped his hand, and in that instant, I was ripped free. The vortex collapsed behind me, swallowing the darkness that had tried to claim me. But as I landed back on solid ground, I saw something that made my heart stop. The spirits were gone. The woman in black, the children, the restless souls. They had vanished, as if the park itself had released them. The park, once so full of torment, was suddenly silent. The air was still, calm, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was alone. I turned to thank the caretaker, but he was gone. His presence had faded, as if he had never been there. Only his words remained. "You have freed them, but at what cost?" I stood there, unsure of what to make of it all. The park was quiet now, but the question haunted me. Had I truly freed them? Or had I simply replaced one curse with another? As I left the gates of the abandoned amusement park, the once oppressive atmosphere lifted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The park was gone, but the curse, it never truly leaves, not entirely. And in the distance, I could have sworn I saw her again, the woman in black, standing by the gate, watching me. But this time I didn't run. I just kept walking, knowing that some mysteries, some horrors, are meant to be left in the shadows. The days that followed my escape from the deserted amusement park were strange, filled with an eerie silence that I couldn't shake. I tried to resume my normal life, to forget the horrors that had unfolded in that forsaken place. But no matter how hard I tried, the memories haunted me. At night, I would hear distant laughter echoing in my mind, the sound of children's giggles blending with the shrill cries of the woman in black. The park, though abandoned, had left its mark on me. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was imagining things. After all, how could something so dark and twisted, something so impossible, truly exist? But there was one undeniable truth. The park had been real. Its history, its spirits, and the curse that had bound them to that desolate place. Those were real. And in the end, I was left with more questions than answers. I couldn't forget the caretaker, the man who had somehow guided me out of the abyss, only to disappear before my eyes. Was he a ghost too? A trapped spirit trying to help others find freedom? Or had he been something else entirely? an entity sent to protect the secrets of the park? I had no way of knowing. But his warning still echoed in my ears. You have freed them, but at what cost? Was I truly free? Or had I merely unleashed something far worse? In the weeks that followed, I began to notice strange things. At first it was subtle, a shadow in the corner of my eye, a whisper when no one was around, objects that would shift or disappear without explanation. But then it grew worse. I would find myself waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, unable to move, as if something invisible was holding me down. The faces of the children from the park would flash before my eyes, their hollow eyes staring into mine, accusing me of something I couldn't understand. I began to question everything. Was it the curse that had followed me, or was I simply losing my mind? One evening, I decided to return to the park. Maybe, just maybe, I could find some answers. But when I arrived, the gate was locked. The iron bars rusted and twisted, as though time itself had distorted them. The once familiar sight of the Ferris wheel, its towering frame now a silhouette against the twilight sky, was gone. The park was no longer there. In its place was a field of overgrown grass, the ground cracked and barren. No remnants of the old rides, no traces of the haunted carousel or the decaying funhouse. The park, once alive with screams and laughter, had vanished entirely. It was as though it had never existed, leaving nothing behind but the ghosts of memories and forgotten fears. I felt a cold chill creep up my spine as I stood there, staring at the empty space. Had it all been a dream? Was it possible that I had imagined the entire thing? Or had the park truly disappeared, leaving no trace of its existence behind? That was when I realized something chilling. The park had never really been about the rides, the games, or the children. It had always been about the souls it had claimed, the cursed spirits that had been trapped within its walls, never to escape. And now that it was gone, those spirits were still out there, still lingering in the shadows, still searching for a way to break free. But they weren't the only ones. I realized with growing dread that I too was a part of that curse now. I had become one of them. The park had claimed me as its own, whether I was aware of it or not. The spirits, the woman in black, the children, they were not gone. They were inside me, their whispers in my mind, their eyes following my every step. And as I turned to leave, the ground beneath me shifted, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something, or someone, standing in the distance. The familiar shape of the Ferris wheel, now in the background of my mind, its lights flickering in the distance as though calling me back. I ran, but it wasn't over. It would never be over. I realized the truth then. The park might have vanished, but its grip on me was eternal. It had never truly been about the location. It had always been about the curse that lingered in the air, the spirits that refused to be forgotten, and the souls that would never find peace. The park may be gone, but the curse was alive, and it had found a new home. It had found me. Final reflection. As the days went by, I continued to search for answers, for some way to free myself from the torment that had followed me since my encounter with the abandoned amusement park. But no matter how hard I tried, nothing seemed to change. The memories of the park's horrors would not fade, and the sense of being watched, being followed, only grew stronger. I often wonder if anyone else who has ventured into the park ever truly escaped its grasp. Was I the first to uncover its dark secrets? Or were there others before me, lost to the same fate? And what of those who come after me? Will they too fall prey to its curse? Or will they find a way to break free? The questions linger, unanswered, as I continue to live with the haunting knowledge that I am forever linked to that place. The park may be gone, but its legacy, its curse, will live on, forever etched into the fabric of time. And for those who dare to seek its forgotten truths, beware. The darkness that lives there is not just a part of the past, it is a part of us all. And once it claims you, there is no escape.